Good day, my poetry people. Over here in my section of Norton Anthologies. These are really, really great books. Pretty much anything you want is going to be in a Norton Anthology. Alright, where did we leave off here? Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Let's see here, my fancy little bookmark. Torn piece of yellow paper. Alright, part one ended with Whitman, or the speaker I'm just going to call Whitman because it works better anyway. Whitman saying, and you who shall cross from shore to shore, years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. So in 1864 he's saying, I have thought about you, you people of the future, more than you think I've thought of you. And then part two begins with the sentence, or actually a series of sentence fragments, which is very Whitman-esque. The impalpable sustenance of me from all things at all hours of the day. The simple, compact, well-joined scheme, myself disintegrated, everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme. And then you have that repetition of the. So I'm assuming this is in his meditation, so he's saying, I've thought about you in the future, and there's an assumed, I've thought about the impalpable sustenance, the simple compact, similitudes, the glories, blah, 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 a list of all these things in part two. But the first line of part two, which is part 6 in the poem, he uses the term the impalpable sustenance. So impalpable is defined as something that you cannot touch, and sustenance is something that nourishes you or gives you fuel. So he has this, he's saying there's something that gives him nourishment or fuel, but it's not something that can be touched or dealt with by the five senses. Something emotional. So there's an emotional sustenance that comes to him. So if you mix around the impalpable sustenance of me or my impalpable sustenance from all things at all hours of the day. So he's saying that things around him give him a type of emotional or maybe spiritual nourishment. And it's safe to say spiritual here. Because in the next line, he talks about a simple, compact, well-joined scheme. So he mentions there's some simple scheme, it's compacted all together, and then he mentions himself in relation to this. Myself disintegrated, everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme. So he brings up some scheme here, and says that he, as an individual, is disintegrated from the scheme, or into the scheme. His use, or his sentence construction here is vague. You can interpret this as him as an individual is disintegrated from some larger scheme. So again, he's at the ferry terminal, perhaps he's talking about all the people around him, the society, or like the human ecosystem, or even the larger ecosystem that he finds himself in. As individuals, we're cut off from this. We have our own sense of consciousness, like we are an individual and our identity. That we are individually disintegrated from the scheme. We see ourselves as an independent unit. And then he says perhaps everybody else here is an individual part of that unit. Yet he says it is part of the scheme. Or the other interpretation you can give it is like himself, out of his individualism, is disintegrated into the scheme when he realizes he's part of some larger ecosystem or some part of some social system, that he is disintegrated from an individual into this scheme. And many times with poetry, I like to give them the credit saying perhaps the poet meant to say both of these at the same time because they're both true, but the text lends itself to both interpretations. So you have him receiving sustenance, an invisible sustenance, emotional, spiritual sustenance from things at all hours of the day. So an example of this is anything that keeps you going, gets you out of bed during the day. So like maybe it could be, I was just petting my little puppy, that feeling you get from something that you like. You can't really touch it, even though you're touching a little puppy when you're playing, but like that feeling of the things that make life good and give us motivation, or if you remember William Blake, his energy, the things that motivate us, these emotional somethings that happen, whether it's love, the things that excite you, it could just be like your perception of like finding something beautiful, but that gives you that motivation to keep going through your days. So he says that, yes, so we are part of some scheme. So we know Just as in part 1 he said, like, flood tide I see face to face, clouds I see face to face, he brings himself from the individual into some part of some larger scheme. And he follows that up in line, 6, 7, 8, and says, the similitudes of past and those of the future. So that's a Whitman version of the word similarities. So he's saying there are similarities between the past and future. And that's something that also gives him sustenance. Okay, and this is in his meditations where he's thought about these things already before. So he's thought about the similarities from the past and future. So he's trying to take himself out of his time, where people are attired in their usual costumes, and think about the universal among human beings. So he's saying he's part of some larger scheme, and this has to do with the similarities of the past and the future, so he begins to take himself out of just the time and ecosystem he lives in, but that he's part of some larger scheme, and you can feel this when you think about the similarities of the past and future. And then he starts looking around himself while he's at the ferry terminal. The glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings, on the walk in the street and the passage over the river. So you know that feeling when you're in that moment where you feel like transcendent above like the person you are, that you're part of something larger, and like you're going to look back and remember this moment, how everything takes on this glow of like importance, and he sees these glories strung like beads on like everything that's around him. Then in line 10 he looks at the current of the river, the current rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away. So this could be the river's current coming down from the East River, going out into the New York Harbor and then out into the ocean, or it could be the ocean current, this flood tide that's coming in and pushing its way up. But he says it takes something of him with him as the current goes away. So this could be in his imagination, he's imagining like where this is going, or he could be implying that, who is this similar to? Like when we study Pablo Neruda, that the things we come in contact with, we leave like a little piece of ourselves on them, and then they travel independently of us, but it takes part of our essence with it. So maybe he's personifying the river again and saying the river or the ocean, and saying because it's come in contact with me and I've had this emotional experience with the ocean or the river, it takes part of me away with it. So that we're not just like isolated individuals in our bodies end like with our skin, that we're part of something larger, and that when he comes in contact with the river, he becomes part of the river, and the river takes on part of himself. Line 11, he turns to the others that are to follow me, the ties between me and them. Okay, so again, he's thinking about the people in the future, so the people who will follow him or come after him, that there are ties between us. So even though we're removed 164 years, I think it was, in time, 166 years, something like that, that there are ties between us. So he's died long ago, people will come after us, but he's saying there are something that binds us together. And then he'll start listing those later in the poem. But he's saying there are ties between me in my present day and you in your future, in the year 2020 or whenever you're reading this. The certainty of others, the life, love, sight, hearing of others. Okay, so then he looks at the world through other people's points of view, the people around him and the people in the future. We do have certainties that we base our lives around. And so he's bringing up like how much is this true, these things that we really believe, or how much are just like fads, like the costumes we wear, the clothes we wear in our days. What is universal? What fades away? Is the certainty of the things that we see and we feel, how certain are those things, or how real are those things? How real are our lives, our love, the sight, the hearing of things? Are these things universal, or are they just like fads that die off, and then one day when our universe, the sun expands and burns our planet away, is that stuff all going to be gone, or was it part of some larger scheme? And then he starts making proclamations in the second part of this part 2. So from line 13 to 19, he assumes things about other people, the people around him and the people of the future. So he says, others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore, just like he's doing on these days. Others will watch the run of the flood tide coming in and watching the way it plays with the waves in the river. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west, and heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands large and small. So he's looking at things that are going to exist that we still to this day, 164 years later, can stand in that spot where Whitman stood, and we can see people crossing the ferry back and forth. We can see the flood tide coming in and the way that makes the river look. We can see ships going up and down in Manhattan, and the small islands, I don't know what just fell down there, the islands that exist in New York Harbor, like Governor's Island and the one the Statue of Liberty is on. You have a couple islands out there. So people will be able to see those in years in the future. So it's building up this, will those people be thinking the same things I'm thinking, or because they live in a different time, it will be completely different in a different context. 50 years hence, others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them, see these things. And ending on line 19, you assume the others will enjoy the sunset, the pouring into the flood tide, the falling back to sea of the ebb tide. Okay, so he makes a different proclamation here than he's made in the poem. He's saying, others will enjoy these things. So the sunset, the flood tide, watching the ebb tide go back. So not only do you have this cycle of the tides where yes, things look different, but it's part of some larger scheme. So when it's low tide, the world looks one place, but that's not permanent. High tide will come back, but you can't just take a snapshot of one place in time and say this is a complete picture of existence. There's a cycle that things go in, but it's some part of some larger scheme. But what's neat is he uses the word enjoy and say there's something in the sunset that humans will always enjoy, and there's something of the play of the water that humans will always enjoy, and the clouds and the birds and every beautiful thing that he sees. He says people will always be drawn to these things. So he makes this assumption that there is a universal something that's larger than us, and because we're part of this well-joined scheme, we're always going to be attracted to sunsets. There's some sort of truth there that he talks about in line 12, that certainty of others, the love, the sight, that yes, there is something, since we're attracted to this over and over and over, there's some larger truth that's embodied there that will keep captivating us. Okay, and I'll stop there with part 2, and part 3 will continue with that idea, but he makes a proclamation, in the first line of part 3. It avails not time or place, distance avails not. So he's basically saying, regardless of where you are, who you are, or what time of history you live, human beings will always be attracted to sunsets. Okay, and I'll stop right there. Let's see, put this back in Norton Anthology. Goodbye.